What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Phantom Brigade, following its 2.0 update, which launched at the end of last year. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video going over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. And to that end, a note on the achievements for this one. I did notice while playing through this that on the 2.0 version, a couple of the achievements don't seem to work consistently. However, the good news there is if you are having trouble unlocking any of them on the 2.0 version, they actually have a beta branch over on Steam of the game's previous version where they were all working. And so you can, at any time, just switch over to that beta branch and unlock them that way, which is something I had to do for like the Take It Back achievement as an example. It was one that wasn't working on the 2.0 version for me. But in any event, if you just switch over that old beta branch, you should be able to get them to work. Otherwise, though, let's go ahead and talk about the game itself. So, Phantom Brigade is a TRPG doing some novel stuff that initially launched back at the beginning of 2023. Very generally, people liked what it was doing with like simultaneous turn-based, that kind of thing. However, it was also a little bare bones, and by the time I got around to going to check it out, they had already announced that they were working on a 2.0 update. This 2.0 update launched just last year in 2025, specifically around November. I'm doing this in January, so it's only been a couple of months. And this 2.0 update changed quite a bit. And having played some of the original version, in order to get some of those achievements, I can definitely say that it was a sizable upgrade. And while for the sake of this review being consistent, we're mainly going to talk about the 2.0 stuff here, one of by far the biggest changes is what they did with the pilot system. So we're going to be operating mechs. Those are operated by pilots, and where these guys were very bare bones previously, here they have traits, they have level up paths, they have classes even, and so putting the right pilot in the right mech is going to make you much more effective in combat, as an example. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because they also reworked some of the campaign to have more story, though that's nothing too crazy, mind you. However, they also added stuff like new maps, new provinces, new points of interest within those maps, just like things to discover, basically. And so while even the 2.0 update is not like some gigantically replayable game, it is a very large improvement over that original version. Barring that, however, at its core, this is really a game about utilizing a bunch of mechs to take out as many enemies as possible as you fight to take a country back from invaders, while utilizing a fun, again, sort of novel combat system that I think really carries the whole thing. And while it's not really a game I would expect people to spend an enormous amount of time with, I do think it's fun and worth talking about otherwise. So first, let's talk about the technical state of the game. For the most part, this game ran very well for me. The only really thing to report here was that on occasion, the game would seem like it was about to freeze up and crash for a few seconds before finally popping back in and allowing me to play it normally. So the reason I say it seems like it was about to crash is like the desktop cursor would pop up and everything. But after a couple of seconds of that, it would always like pop back into the game. And while that was a little bit annoying, it didn't happen enough to be like a huge problem or anything. And it was really the only issue I encountered. So not exactly a big deal at the end of the day. And so let's go ahead and move on to difficulty a bit. So Phantom Brigade has an extremely customizable difficulty. It also has, I guess you could call it mod support baked in the sense that there is in the main menu a section to organize your mods and stuff from like Steam Workshop. There is even an achievement specifically for using mods, and that stuff combined with what you can do with the difficulty modifiers section. This game can be easy or it can be very hard or anything in between, basically. But at a baseline, the game has an easy, normal, and hard difficulty as presets, but then you can go in and customize individual things like outgoing damage, heat generation, salvage that you'll pick up from battles, that kind of thing, how it affects pilots, and all this other stuff, allowing you to get a little more granular beyond even just the preset. And so I imagine if you just tinker a little bit, you'll find something that you feel comfortable with, which is especially important, I think, because this is not a game that really has like a big fail state or anything, meaning that if you're not careful, you might accidentally back yourself into a corner, and being able to adjust the difficulty on the fly, which you can do, may prevent you from just like outright losing an entire run and feeling like you wasted your time or something. Keeping it moving though, let's next up talk about the story setup and my thoughts about it. So the story here is a bit odd. in the sense that it's not exactly hard to grasp or wrap your head around, but it was changed and altered from the original version. And so in 2.0 here, basically what it comes down to is that you are from a country that I believe is called like Fearland. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, but either way, it is experimenting with mechs and an experimental technology called their prediction system. Right as this is going live, the country gets invaded by Cascade forces, I think it is, and while you do your best to salvage the initial invasion, things go sideways, and ultimately you form a resistance utilizing this prediction technology that you've kept safe in the interim. So a couple years after that happens, you start taking the fight back to the Cascade forces in an effort to liberate the provinces and eventually take back the country from these invaders. Your sort of secret sauce, if you will, though, is the prediction technology. This allows you to see ahead into the future, more or less, for about the next 5 seconds, and this is what we are going to use in order to take our simultaneous turns, which is going to give you an edge over the enemy's overwhelming numbers in most cases. And that's really kind of all there is to the story, honestly. It's not exactly an in-depth one. It's relatively bare bones, so if we're all being honest, probably not a game you would play specifically for the story, though it is there and serves its purpose well enough, I suppose. And so let's move on to progression. There is a decent chunk of progression in this game, mostly down to things like your base, your individual pilots, your mech, the gear that you're coming up with through the workshop, that kind of thing. But let's start with the base upgrades. As part of the tutorial, you get your hands on a mobile base crawler. You can upgrade this base over the course of the campaign using a variety of different materials, and what this allows you to do is do all sorts of stuff, like upgrade your workshop, allowing you to craft more and faster, upgrade the speed of the mobile base crawler as you will be driving it across the overworld, which has some implications, and then there's also like the ability to expand how many pilots and mechs you can have with you, that kind of thing. So that's important. Now the pilots are also a really big part of progression. You'll have to recruit and maintain them. They can die on you, but at first pilots are rookies. After you get them their initial level, you'll unveil their specialization, and that can be things like Defender, Sharpshooter, Interceptor, or Engineer. Now personally, Interceptor wound up being my favorite, but I did have a Sharpshooter that I used frequently. But more than anything, it's kind of about matching their specialty to the mech that you are putting them in. As each of these trees has several different upgrade paths. Now, they also have an inherent trait that is important to them. But as they level up, you'll pick more of these traits, and then once they get to level 5, you can actually start prestiging them, which is basically resetting their level ups while also keeping one of the traits that you've gotten as you leveled them up, making them stronger and stronger as you go. But really the most important thing to understand here is that you want to match what that pilot is good at with the mech that you put them in. But it's also important to try to increase their stats, like for instance, their fatigue or their trauma limit. Fatigue is pretty much what it sounds like. You can only use pilots in so many missions before they get fatigued, and you really don't want to use them at that point, and you'll have to rest, but we'll get to that in a moment. Then we've got our mechs. So you will obviously be building and customizing your mechs, which does come with a bit of cosmetic customization if you're into that, but more than anything it comes down to putting parts on a mech. Now the thing you have to watch out for here are things like heat as well as mass, because mass is going to slow a mech down, basically making it not able to move as far as it would normally. And this means that if you put things like backpack equipment or really heavy weapons or just heavy parts in general, that mech might be able to take more damage but won't move very fast. And then heat dissipation is important because that effectively determines how many times you can act or take an attack even per turn. And all of that comes down to a bunch of customizable gear, which is going to determine how that mech behaves in combat, with all sorts of then mods that you can add to those bits of gear, which makes it a pretty in-depth system overall. And you can get really granular if you want to. Though I will say one of my most effective mechs that I really enjoyed playing around with was a mech using a heavy weapon that didn't even move all that much. But you can also do fun stuff that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like you can equip shields to these guys, and you can use those shield guys to ram into other mechs and knock them down, which is a fun way to like almost steal turns from the enemy even. Shields can also be used to reflect things like beam weapons, and you can basically just do a lot of stuff here, and it feels pretty good, honestly. There's a good amount of variety for the length of this game in terms of how you build these mechs, and it's satisfying to get in there and mess around with them. Now, the other bit of progression is the workshop. As you complete missions and the like, you'll be salvaging and just picking up a lot of gear and parts for these mechs, and that is going to lead into the workshop as well. Now, the workshop is a little on the weak side simply because there's not a lot of reason to actually craft anything other than more mechs. The workshop is where you'll make more of them. While you will unlock the ability to craft equipment, that will be like the main gear level of the workshop that you've unlocked up to that point, which you unlock further by just scrapping more parts from the level that you were on, basically. You're going to be picking up so much salvage, more than likely, and just getting parts from missions that there's really just not much of a point in spending resources specifically on making gear. That said, there are moments where you can craft a specific weapon you want to use if you haven't been having a lot of luck with finding an upgrade, that kind of thing. So it's not like the workshop doesn't have its place, but it really isn't as useful as I would have liked it to have been. Which brings us to the gameplay portion and then combat following that. So on the gameplay side of things, it's relatively simple. You basically are making your way towards the capital of the country, but in order to do that, you have to work your way through provinces. Now, once you are in a province, you'll drive your mobile base crawler around, either encountering special events which can be uncovered and potentially give you resources and the like, or of course taking on enemy missions. Now, what these missions consist of, you'll have noticed hopefully before you entered a given province. Some of these provinces are optional and don't have to be fought at all, or at least initially if you don't want to. But when you are selecting the next province to go to try to take the fight to them, you can kind of see what that province's general makeup of enemies, be that like reserves or the regular army or experimental special ops, that kind of thing, and that will tell you ahead of time the type of resistance you can expect to face there. But your main goal is basically to take out the enemy or fill up a bar by performing successful missions before the enemy regroups, which takes place usually in about a day or so. Driving around takes time, and so you have to ideally prevent the enemy from regrouping, because if you do, you get a bunch of negative circumstances which can affect your mechs and your pilots, that kind of thing. That said, your goal is essentially just to fill up the bar in the left in a couple of stages before the final stage where you take the final battle in order to liberate the province. There's a few different mission types, just straight up fights, missions where you have to go out of your way to preserve civilian infrastructure. There are assassination missions where you are specifically trying to kill a high-ranking officer. I actually like those missions a lot because if you set them up properly, they're really surgical. They tend to have overwhelming enemy numbers, and so what you want to do is set up a team to just really quickly jump in, kill the guy, and then retreat immediately. And I just had a lot of fun sort of planning those out. There's also takeovers and hold this point type of missions, so there's a decent variety there, and for as long as the game is, I think it's fine. A typical playthrough is maybe 15-20 hours, so over that specific period of time I think it's fine. But if the game had gone on longer, and if you choose to continue playing after taking the capital, for instance, you're probably going to get bored with them after a little while. That said, you still have to manage your mobile base crawler and resting. So outside of just upgrading your base, you do actually have to move it around as mentioned, and this is important because you'll want to avoid patrols ideally, as they will attack you and potentially cause you all sorts of problems. However, the big thing is that you occasionally need to rest, which requires camp supplies, because as your pilots and mechs get damaged in combat, the way you're going to replenish fatigue and health on your mechs and everything is to rest. You'll be able to pick a few of these guys to recuperate based on how upgraded your workshop is, as an example, which will get them back in fighting shape again. And so you have to balance that against not letting the enemy regroup, but also making sure that you don't back yourself into a corner where you don't have any camp supplies and a bunch of injuries and mechs and stuff that are going down. Because when pilots and the like take enough damage in combat or a mech gets destroyed, they are two different things. They typically take on either a trauma or a fracture, depending on whether or not it's a pilot or a mech respectively, and they can only take so many of these before they are permanently gone. Now, on the pilot side of things, traumas will inflict permanent, for the most part, debuffs on that character. I did notice on occasion there were prestige levels where it gave you the option to remove those traumas, so even then it's not necessarily completely permanent. But basically, you just kind of got to manage your team and make sure that you keep them able to fight off the enemies that you are trying to fight, so you don't get pushed into a corner and unable to win. But speaking of that, let's go ahead and talk about combat. So this game's main thing really is its simultaneous turn-based system. That is to say, it is turn-based, but you and the enemies take your turns literally at the same time. Now, in the case of this game, it handles that by allowing you to set up 5-second increments via the game's prediction system based on each of the mechs that you have fielded into that particular battle. Now, you do this in a way that is honestly kind of reminiscent of how professional video editing software works, which I thought was funny. You align things on a timeline and sliders and all that stuff, but basically, whether you want your characters to move at a given time, that kind of thing, you arrange it on the timeline bar for them before you've got your turn set up, and then you press execute, and that 5 seconds plays out. However, there's obviously a few more things to know, and while that is novel enough, this is where stuff like mech's movement speed, heat dissipation, all that stuff comes into play. Now, starting with movement speed, that's actually more important than you might think, because you might want to run through how you set up your characters to move because of collisions. And when you start a map or a fight, all of your mechs are relatively close together, and they may very well run into each other, causing them to crash. Crash basically means that for whatever reason, a mech has to get back up on its feet if possible, and it's down for a certain amount of time. This is often the result of collisions, running mechs and stuff directly into your enemies. The winner of that collision is based on a bunch of different factors, everything from pilot traits down to the weight class of the individual mech, which, by the way, it's a very fun thing to do, especially if you've set up a more melee-oriented mech as an example. You can sort of build them with the idea of charging them into enemies, crashing those enemies, and then unleashing a melee attack. That's actually pretty fun. However, the catch here is that you can also run into your own mechs and cause crashes and collisions with them as well, and that's something you'll obviously want to avoid for the most part, and so when you're setting up your preview, do make sure that their movement paths are not overlapping and they're not running over each other. That's a lesson you'll probably learn pretty quick, as I had to. But then there's the attacks. Now, this is obviously subject of their weapon type, like how long an attack takes is based on the weapon and stuff that you have equipped. But another aspect of it is heat. Every attack or dash generates heat, and if your mech gets too hot, you start taking damage until you cool down. The better your heat dissipation, the more actions you can take against the enemy, which is very important. Some weapons actually play into this and allow you to put status effects on enemies, such as overheating them by attacking them. However, even then, the game does some fun stuff as well. Oftentimes there might be bodies of water on the map, and you can have a mech stand in those to help them cool off faster. Rain plays an effect here, where if you happen to be on a map where it is raining, you'll get better heat dissipation, stuff like that. But as mentioned, your weapons also play a really big role here. Weapons tend to have an optimal range, which requires you to move into, ideally, that optimal range. And then there are both indestructible and destructible forms of cover. Indestructible cover is typically natural formations of the map, like the actual ground, things like that, and then all sorts of buildings and whatnot can be attacked. Most weapons have a structure damage variable, allowing you to chew through buildings. There's even missions specifically designed around causing as much infrastructure damage as possible. That's a really fun way to go, but not only do you have to worry about the weapons you're using, their ranges, things like that, but also positioning, because the direction you attack a mech from also matters, because it determines what part of that mech you are most likely to hit. Now, generally, when you destroy any part of a mech, they tend to go into a crashing state, but it also allows you to get at their core, and destroying that will destroy them outright. And while you want to avoid that with pilot ejection, because if the mech goes down, your pilot might get injured, things like that, you don't necessarily have to do it that way, but ejecting your pilot and sort of just getting out of harm's way that way is an option for you. And you can also even force enemies to do it. But the reason I'm telling you this more specifically is because there are weapons that also tend to focus more on damaging the pilot as much as the mech. And using that as a way to, say, force an enemy pilot ejection can sort of be another avenue to tackle combat from, as an example. And so even then, there's a lot of variety in the ways you can approach these interesting simultaneous turn-based that makes for a pretty fun novel system. The only downside to my mind being really that it does get a bit repetitive in the sense that, like, once you've figured it out, all of the combat encounters play out more or less the same way. There's also the fact that every single turn you do have to like manually time out and place every single action that your guys are going to take. And while that can be fun, it is occasionally kind of annoying, especially with battles that you know you're going to win, but you're going to have to like chase down an enemy and micromanage all your turns to make that happen, even though your victory is already assured more or less. And there are moments like that where the system feels very tedious, even if its broader concept is novel and interesting. Still, very neat concept, however, and that does finally bring us to the Steam Deck section for this game. Now, officially speaking, this game has a playable rating over on Steam, though truth be told, I don't think I would personally recommend it there. Which is a shame because TRPGs tend to do pretty well on that platform, but in this case, I mean, if you can have an annoyance, it's probably there. The game doesn't really have controller support in mind, so you're probably going to have to set up the controls, the text on screen, especially all the different variations that can apply to your mech, are very small and can be hard to read, and so you might have to use the magnifying tool. While you can get the game to run decently well, you're also going to have to go in and more than likely adjust a bunch of stuff to make that happen. And so, long story short, while you can play this on the Steam Deck, you're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops to do that, and I don't personally find it enjoyable, so I would probably just not choose to play this one there, but obviously that's going to be up to you at the end of the day. More than anything, though, I would say expect some problems as you do this. That, however, brings us to the positives and negatives before we start wrapping this thing up. So on the positive side of things, honestly, the 2.0 update, especially having to jump back and play the original version for a little bit, was impressive to see in terms of what it added, especially with the pilots. I'm happy that they, especially, pushing 3 years after release, dropped this big update that improved upon the base game quite a bit. I think that was a really neat thing to do. I also just really enjoyed the novelty of this game's combat system and the way it approached turn-based. I would actually love to see this combat system taken further even. Tweaks, adjustments, more complexity, that kind of thing. The core of that experience, I think, is probably the most noteworthy thing about this game, and it's really fun to mess around with, at least for a little while, because, as part of the negatives here, it's a game that is relatively limited in scope. It's basically just trying to do this one thing, and while it's totally fine, it does see things getting a bit stale relatively quickly. Like, I would say we're probably like about 10 or so hours into this game, you've more than likely seen everything it's going to offer. And that's fine if you enjoy what it's doing. There's plenty there to engage with still to come. However, once you've got that initial bit figured out, you're pretty much got it. It's not going to change or evolve from there. Add on top of that some slight annoyances, like for instance having to micromanage your turns as you track down the final objective of a battle you are going to win, can be a little annoying. So, as with any game, there are some negatives in there. However, that does bring us to our conclusion, which is that for $30 US full price, though this game is on sale pretty regularly as it is well past its release, and by the way, I did buy this game quite some time ago, waiting on its 2.0 update. I think it's a good time for that price. Now, again, because it's been a few years, people might just want to wait for a sale generally. However, I think $30 is about right for this, especially if you're really into TRPGs. And if you want to, you can find it for even cheaper. But for that price, you're getting a game that does a very novel thing in a genre that is honestly been a little bit stale for quite some time. TRPGs have kind of been boiled down to like a specific formula that a lot of them follow. And this game tries to break that mold a little bit and do something a little different. And so while it is not like a revolutionary title or anything, I think if you really love the genre, it's worth checking this game out just to see kind of what it was doing with this prediction and turn-based system. And so for those reasons, it gets a buy out of me, but otherwise, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.